Hello, everyone. Get down your names. So I hope you guys are doing all right. So we are, this week is the first week we're going to do a textbook quiz. So don't forget that, okay? Do Sunday night along with your argumentative assignment. And please be sure to look for the test. I'm going to post the test ahead of time. I know I've said that already, and I failed to ask yet, but I'm going to do that. And be sure that you are reading all the numbers for these argumentative assignments, right? To make sure that you're familiar with the different theses on different topics. We got a big crowd today. So let me count and see if I have the right number. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, good. 17 of you plus me, and I have 17 names. All right, so moving on to the, let's see here, share screen. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. So your Southern Colonies handout, right? So be familiar with the following approaches, okay? Firstly, the whole idea of American exceptionalism is that we are a special nation, right? We're different in a superior way, right? And there are a couple familiar themes that come along with the idea of American exceptionalism. Remember, oftentimes they call that history court history, right? C-O-U-R-T. Like a court scribe writing of his king or emperor, he's going to write very glowingly terms, right? And praises that leader. So with court history, they contend that we're a nation uniquely of opportunity, right? When we look at like the standards of the Enlightenment, right? As far as egalitarianism today, everyone on equal footing. No one inherently should have a foot up over anyone else, and is certainly not considered or to be considered inherently more valuable as a human being as far as his or her rights and entitlements, etc. We talk about mainly equality of opportunity, right? We definitely look for that in number one, where there's a little bit of court history where we're trying to contend that that America from the get-go was a little bit different. It was different from England. It was different from early modern Europe at this time in the 16 and 1700s, that there were unique opportunities found here that you didn't find elsewhere. And of course, what you should look for in particular, two kind of they go along with it, are oftentimes a scarcity of labor, right? And abundance of available, notice I didn't say vacant, available land, legally available land. And those are oftentimes harped upon in court history books about how much land there was for the taking for English colonists coming over, how many jobs were, and not just how many jobs, with labor scarcity, as it often happens in human history, right? When there's a great scarcity of labor, the leverage is in the hands of the laborers because they know they're needed. And so oftentimes wages and opportunities, a part of that job, tend to increase and improve as well. However, um, some people would contend, right, that, okay, where are you going with this? Are you in particular boasting of capitalism? I think of in particular a guy named Paul Johnson. He wrote a history of the American people, and he's very court history in many manners. And he, in particular, seems to be pretty almost enamored with the capitalist system as just you get the same arguments oftentimes, right? That capitalism or free enterprise, everything in private hands, everything competitively between one another, right? Is more amenable with human nature. That's a drive within us, right, to improve our lot, to help ourselves and our own, etc. But also that capitalism is about freedom and about fairness, right? Whereby it's like a sports tournament or something, right? Whoever continues to win and doesn't get eliminated and is the last man standing has merited, has earned his or her success. Now, of course, you're familiar with like modern um, progressive Democrats who contend, right, that capitalism without government intervention is too it's too Darwinian. It's it's um, it's too parasitical. That for one person to win, someone else has to lose, right? And that it's the same old story. That it's a rich man's war, or not war. I'm sorry, a rich man's world, right? So notice the kind of balance that is attempted to be struck with those two different chords. Okay. On the one hand, a little bit of chord history, contending, right, that there were opportunities in early English North America that didn't exist elsewhere. But on the other hand, saying, well, it must be conceded that the wealthy continued to have a huge advantage over those less wealthy, right? Less fortunate. So hence, right, the title, Capitalism for Better and for Worse. Okay? So feel free to choose that one and give an example or two of what's used to support it and then evaluate it. All right? Let's see here. Then the next two, I believe, let me make sure and look to number three. Yes, the next two are diametrically opposed. They're more avenues and just directions you could take a book on Jamestown than these two. It's a little bit superficial, but it is what it is. At this point, it's on. I have these two on my assignment, and that is right is a bit of a blame game. Okay, a bit of a blame game. So you have the old school court histories, right? Written by, oftentimes written in the form of primary sources, people that were at that time period in the early 1600s in Virginia and were living at this time, right? And left a written account of such. And then you have subsequently, like in the early to mid to late 1800s, a lot of court historians jumped on board and said, we have a special country because what was going on at the time, right? We would overcome the Civil War. We were facing the Industrial Revolution, the second one technically, but the big one. And we were very proud of ourselves, so to speak. And so it showed in the history books. And so we were a special country, et cetera, right? So if you wanted to do that, what of course is a very primitive method that you could begin with, and that is vilifying the Native Americans, right? Trying to take away the mystique of the Native Americans being innocent victims, and try to depict them. And we already went over this with the Black Legend, right? And and then what they do, the old school court historians, and what you find on number three is they love to do great man history of John Smith, right? And they love the fact that note that John Smith was not born into wealth. He was not part of the aristocracy. He was not born into a wealthy merchant or bourgeois people of the city family. Um, he was not one of the five greatest largest contributors to the joint stock company of the Virginia Company, right? And so hence he couldn't sit initially on the governing board, much less be the governor. But the point is, right, is you say, well, this guy is like a microcosm. He's like a mini example of the American leaders later on. Is this guy is going to earn his stripes, right? He's going to earn his stripes. And he's not going to do it in the standard contemporary way through academia or even entrepreneurial route of a business. But what he's going to do, right, is he's going to show the grit and the tough characteristics that are oftentimes tied in American court history to rugged individualism, right? A person who could stand on his own 2 feet, and you could put him in any given ferocious environment, and he's going to end up standing on his feet, right? And that's what they like to do with John Smith, is they depict and say, look, this guy was a nobody in the eyes of the leaders, but time and time again, he saw things coming, right? He saw Native American attack. He perceived and claims to have foreseen that they were going to attack and tried to warn everybody, and the leaders wouldn't take his word. And sure enough, they were attacked. In another case, he told them not to put their weapons down when the natives of Virginia signaled for them to do so when they came to trade with them in the canoes, saying that it would be a trap and they would surely harm them. And then, of course, a horrible fate befell a guy named George Casson, who did just that, put down his arms amongst the early colonists, and the natives captured him, tortured him, and killed him. And so at any rate, John Smith seems to be vindicated one time after another as the guy who, it's the notion, right? You could go to Oxford, like some of the guys, the leaders of the colonial regimes did, but it's completely different being in the real world, right? I've heard the term like sagacity, like worldly wisdom, right? Common sense, street smarts. That John Smith was a man of sagacity, not necessarily an educated man, but he could read people, he could read situations, and he was very pragmatic. And remember, just pragmatic is that you do at any given situation, not necessarily what's consistent with your ideals or ethics, but you do what yields in that particular instance the most practically positive results. So you got good common sense. And that's how John Smith is depicted. However, what happened in times when they were surrounded, starving, they contended, and of course the natives did not, that anytime they tried to come outside the walls of their fort, that they were killed and mutilated by the Native Americans. They were dying of typhoid fever and dysentery. Their numbers went from 500 down to 60 during their second starving time, in a time of obviously disease. And so at any rate, he decided to engage in extortion, to have an armed party go out to nearby villages, especially villages that they had tried to be friendly with and initially were not, right? And he had his party come out and basically put knives to their throats and say, we want you to trade us food or else it's your lives. And then when people didn't cooperate, he had people killed, he burnt down villages. And so hence, right, you can have people contend that John Smith is being praised by court historians, and he was a murderous, arsonist, character. And then going back to number 2, that's what you find oftentimes today, right, is the more politically correct, and to a lot of people, the more accurate depiction of conflict history, right? And remember, conflict history, as opposed to court history, it deals with winners and losers, right? Whoever wins in government, whoever wins in economics, and whoever wins with culture in the social realm, right? But instead of praising the winners, those who get to dictate terms in those 3 categories, conflict history vilifies or makes villains, bad guys, out of the winners. And it wants to elicit our compassion and our empathy for those who lost, right? So a clear example of that is Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn's A People's History of the U.S. That's clearly Marxist conflict history. Depicts it, right, in such a manner that, bear with me, okay? I think it's worth just a moment reading part of a quote. I mean, because he makes it known. Okay, this is the very first page of his book. Let's see here. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears in exchange for glass beads and hawk bells and other trivialities. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features, but they do not bear arms. They do not know them, for they showed them a sword and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made merely of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. That's a quote from Columbus to Ferdinand, right? Then he continues now, begins himself, Howard Zinn. These Arawaks of the Bahama Islands were much like the Indians on the mainland, who were remarkable, European observers were to say again and again, for their hospitality, their belief in sharing. These traits did not stand out in the Europe of the Renaissance, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, the government of kings, the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization and its first messenger to the Americas, Christopher Columbus. And then if you'll bear with me just one more moment, on page 10, he makes it clear. And he says here, my viewpoint in telling the history of the United States is different, that we must not accept the memory of states, or basically the memory of the leaders who wrote the books, right? The winners who write history. Nations are not communities, never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and those dominated, in race and in sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it ought to be the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. And so he goes on and saying that it's inevitable to take a side, Howard Zinn believed, and he was going to side with those who lost. Sorry about that, guys. Um, so at any rate, um, so conflict history does just that. You're going to get a depiction, kind of like the Black Legend, of English Euro-Americans coming in and greedy, right? The ugly imperialist, right? Remember, the imperialist is someone who imposes his will on the sovereignty of another separate governing body or society, right? Whether it be outright taking them over and putting them under his own dominion and flag, whether it be controlling their resources. There are different degrees and levels of imperialism. But in this case, it's outright imperialism, right? It's taking their land, dispossessing them, taking over, right? And so take a look at the beginning of number 2. It says here, to get food, right? And this is the joint stock company known as the Virginia Company. They all put money together. You get a proportion of the profits in proportion to how much, what percentage or ratio you put in the original funds for capital, right? So let's say they put in, $1 million shillings and you put in 500,000 of those shillings, then you're entitled to literally half the profit of whatever they were supposed to find. So they're supposed to come, first this began with Spain and Portugal and the Italian city-states and Indonesia and in the quote Orient in the East and Asia, right? And then it supposedly accidentally happened upon the Bahamas, the Caribbean, and later Central, South, and North America. And so they were ordered, find anything of value, right? Find anything you can of value. And of course, they were all hoping that they could get easy, quick wealth like the Spanish and find, silver or gold like the Spanish did on occasion. But of course, that didn't happen here. So they were said, okay, get access to food before that they perceive you mean to plant among them, right? Assuming that they will grow discontented with your habitation, they were ordered to build a military fort with an invulnerable facade, right? So notice this. According to these key investors, and by the way, the key investors were well-to-do enough that why should they take at one point a 2 out of 5 chance of dying across the Atlantic Ocean when they could pay some other sucker to do the dirty work for them, right? And so John Smith was one of those suckers who decided that, excuse me, that he was going to come and do the work itself and incur the risks physically and personally, and they would treat him as if he had put in so many shares of the money, right, in return for his actual services. And so those who came were told, before they realize you're not leaving, build a fort and make sure that that fort looks invulnerable. Do not, under any circumstances, sell your guns to them. Keep that monopoly against them, right? Try to confine your crops of whatever sort that you consider in your discretion is the best money making commodity you can grow there. Keep it within the protective walls of the palisade or the fort, right? So in the event of an attack or war, you could do such and such. I contrast this, you guys, like with the Bourbon reforms of Spain, when Philip II and others and Jose de Galvez said, you know what, we're going to enlighten these primitive natives of California, but we're not going to do it any longer at the end of a sword. We're going to lure them onto our missions with multiple methods of doing such, and but we are going to benevolently teach them the civilized way, Christian way of life, right? But look at contrast it with this. These guys are saying, guys, take care of your own. The natives are not going to like you, especially once they know you're not leaving. So do not ever trust them, and make sure that they stay afraid and unable to harm you, right? And so what a just an ugly imperialist, if you would, right? He knows he's not wanted, but he's coming anyway, and he's coming to get what he wants, and he doesn't care what you think or what you're going to try to do to deter him. So then you find evidence, right, of there were about 3 or 4 trips that John Smith and a handful of Englishmen took into Powhatan's, the tribal chief that had control of a confederation of over 15,000 people in present day Virginia, including about 11 tribes. And this guy was greatly feared and revered. When John Smith wrote, he wrote in 1608, then in 1612, then in 1624. A few different books on this. Um, of course, you've got to consider the source when he's writing this. He was prone to boast, to be a little bit boastful, and of course, right, he made himself look good, sometimes even and especially at the expense of the image of Native Americans in his book. But he contends that Powhatan was a sight to see, and there was great awe and respect for him. And he contends that the first 3 trips that they had before the famous fourth one um, were were made out of ignorance and good intention. That they began going up the James, what they would rename the James River, etc., into Virginia, and they would try to establish communication and some type of agreement with the local people. So you had the Posbeheg, you don't need to know these names, the Parahunt, the Arohatech, the Appomattox, the Pamunkey, the Chesapeake, that the Chesapeake Bay is named after, all these different tribes that were subjugated to Powhatan, right? And they got a mixed reception on those 3 trips inland. Some welcomed them warmly, some warned them immediately that they would attack them. One particular tribe, I believe it was the Rohatech, actually did attack them immediately. Um, and so word gets back to Sinakamoko, the name of the capital there where Powhatan was, and he ordered this man of mischief, John Smith, right, to be captured and brought to him, according to John Smith. And by the way, other sources that we have to try to corroborate his stories, right? And trust me, not all of them were in agreement with John Smith. They too, at times, said that he was prone to exaggeration and self promotion. But if you're interested in looking up other names and see what they wrote, there's a guy named George Percy, Percy. There's a guy named Gabriel Archer, Archer. There was Edward Wingfield, one of the leaders, like wing of a bird, and then field, right, as one word. Then there was a young man named William Strachey, Strachey, and the list goes on, a few others. So at any rate, we try to put together what they wrote, right? And he's kind of alone in this one, right? John Smith and contending. So we don't know the veracity of the most famous story, right? And that was is that while he was in on his fourth trip hunting, uh, all his other men were killed by Powhatan's brother, his younger brother named. You see that long name somewhere in there several times, Opie Chankano. So Opechancanough kills the others and takes him as a hostage back to Winsnama. And when he brought him there, they went through a trial with a beating of drums, painted him, fed him, etc., had dancing. And then it looked as if they were going to, this is only according to John Smith, you guys. No one else was there. They didn't have the hostage system yet. So they didn't have the English hostage with them to collaborate on this. But at any rate, they supposedly were about to, I'm sorry, you guys, to bludgeon him over a rock, bludgeon his head with wooden weapons. And a 12-year-old daughter named Pocahontas comes and intercedes, falls on his chest, and pleads with her father to spare his life. At that point, some anthropologists believe that this could have been a mock execution and a way of testing his courage and a way of getting him indebted to Powhatan. Because according to John Smith, and it's corroborated by others, Powhatan almost immediately went to the subject of guns when he began to speak with the Jamestown settlers, their representatives at least. He was more concerned, according to multiple sources, of a rival tribe known as the Monacan, Monacan. And he wanted access to the white man's magical fire sticks or their guns, right? And so, at any rate, that's when you supposedly have this clever chess match of wit between John Smith and Powhatan. And of course, John Smith, to his face, is very deferential, but he combines it by outright deceit and saying that he is the most special representative in Jamestown connected directly to a great king and exaggerates the power of the king, the size of England, the number of soldiers in her army, et cetera, right? And said there will be immediately catastrophic retribution if he, as this special man, has a hair on his head harmed by Powhatan. And supposedly it works. So Powhatan doesn't want to harm him, but he likely wasn't planning to anyway. And instead, right, wants to use him for his own devices to try to gain access to those weapons. Well, John Smith gives him deliberately defunctory weapons that didn't work. Then on another occasion, he broke the wheels of a wagon and contended that the heavy artillery could not be dragged to him. He always had an excuse of one sort or another to try to maintain the advantage, the monopoly over gunpowder that the English enjoyed, especially as they were so greatly outnumbered, right? And in a precarious state during the first two winters. So at any rate, you get, from what I continue to read in the primary and secondary sources, is just an environment of distrust and deception, and whereby both sides literally are going to catch the other trying to ambush the other side. And so it's when you play the blame game, you know, it's complex. But again, we're at the mercy of that list of writers that I just named as far as their accounts. But like I said, not all of them were in agreement with John Smith. Not all of them were fans of John Smith. So at any rate, then it ends with claims of attacks of the other and deception and breaking of the alliance of the other by both sides, and isolated incidents. I kid you not, on two very frightful occasions when things were very tense, there was an occasion of a Native American quote, stealing something from Jamestown. And I say, quote, stealing because to anthropologists, they believe that the Powhatan, that there's evidence that they were rather like the Sioux and the Plains natives in the mid to late 1800s in U.S. history, that was that was a way of social mobility, of rising up in status in your tribe by being able to go into enemy territory and bring back some type of physical evidence of their culture, however you went by doing it. And so hence it was actually praised to be able to outwit the white man and steal something of his. And obviously, English notions coming from Germanic and Roman sources were huge on private property at this time, right? And people's rights to their stuff. And so they were uncompromising and wanting to have these culprits handed over. And so you find this time and time again, you guys, the same type of circumstances that are going to beget war. So the first war, Jamestown was established in 1607. They had a war by 1610. And the second one was when Powhatan died and his brother Opechancanough took over. And I believe it was 1622, all the way to 32. It was like a 10-year war. They fought a second Powhatan War. And after that, the English were especially vindictive toward the Native Americans, the Powhatan Confederacy, in taking their land and not respecting any of their rights and former treaties made with them, etc. after the end of that second war. And the Joint Stock Company is going to be stripped of their license by the new crown, and it's going to become a royal colony. And by royal, right, it's no longer owned by a bit of a joint stock private company of investors, but it's owned directly by and claimed directly by the crown. A handpicked governor, he handpicks royal council, and then at the very most, they allow an assembly beneath the council to be elected by those who are considered freedmen. Freedmen in many colonial charters, it was decided freedman status was decided on a few things. One, two often categories were what was it? De sanguinis, like sangre in Spanish, like from blood, and then de natere, and nater is to be born, right? Like nacer in Spanish. And so where you were born or the blood of your mom and dad gave you English citizenship. They called it subjectship at that time, right? And so at any rate, I'm trying to make a segue, you guys, into slavery. So let's go ahead and move on past number 3 to number 4. Now, boy, right, in putting this together, I had a smile on my face, knowing this is very controversial. And it may not even be what I personally subjectively believe, but I thought it was fun to give it a go and to present it. And that is, right, the controversial assertion that slavery, the decision to implement the specific type of chattel slavery that we engaged in here in this country was largely and predominantly an economic decision, not a racist decision. All right. So by all means, feel free to disagree with this. So looking at the contrary, well, let's go in with a thesis, is look for economic support and psychological support of that thesis. Okay. So 1619, the first African enslaved laborers were registered coming into Richmond. And from 1619 to 1642, there was no slave code. So everything was in the air. There was nothing legally finalized, right? And coinciding with that is you had the phenomenon of indentured servitude, right? So indentured servitude, you were to be the laborer for 3 to 7 years of an employer who was willing and able to financially provide food and clothing and shelter for you for those 3 to 7 years, also passage to the New World, right? He or she also was to give you your freedom dues when the 3 to 7 years ended. And the freedom dues oftentimes entailed a freehold, and that's what whatever colony considered was the proper amount for subsistence agriculture, the proper amount of acreage to grow your own food and feed a decent sized family. You were to be taught a trade, and you were to be granted certain provisions, mainly food and utensils, etc., right? As part of your freedom dues when you were done. Well, for whatever reasons, um, I don't mean to oversimplify it because I'm sure it's more complex than this, but in my humble opinion, from my studying, it seems like there's quite a contrast in the reputation in Virginia as opposed to the reputation in Maryland, right? Just above them. In Maryland, there was a guy named George Alsop, Alsop, and you can look at some of his writings, and he contends, right, that becoming an indentured servant was the best thing he ever did in his life, right? That it got him on his feet. It gave him the training and the skills and the work ethic that he needed to succeed in the future. And he was highly, just he highly promoted it on behalf of new immigrants coming in. Then there's a guy named Richard Frethorne, Frethorne. And Richard Frethorne has a famous, pitiful letter back to his parents. And he contends that the indentured servitude was a sham, that it was cruel, right? You look again at Howard Zinn's conflict history book, History of the American People, or People's History of the United States. And you find evidence that they had to have, you were virtually a slave for 3 to 7 years, whatever your contract entailed. They could physically beat you. They could punish you by depriving you of food. Um, they made you carry a pass to be able to leave your master's property at any given time. They even dictated if your social life, and if you could try to court and how much more marry someone. And they especially did so with the women indentured servants, right? Because they didn't want to lose labor in having them become pregnant, because there was nothing in the provisions that stated they were entitled to the children of that procreation. And so at any rate, you have cases of abuse, of raping of the young women. You have cases of people sent against their will, right, into Virginia. Because remember, it was supposed to be an avenue, a stepping stone to the American dream. And it was supposed to be voluntary. But some people were somehow, kind of shanghaied, kidnapped by gangs in Bristol, Liverpool, and London. The government even got involved in this and began sending over inmates, prison inmates, and forcing them to become indentured servants. So that in the 1600s, over 75% of the migrants into Virginia from Europe came as indentured servants. 3/4, right? That's an impoverished population. Literally from 1629 to 1642, when the English Civil War began, 50,000, 50,000 people migrated from England to Virginia alone, according to the sources. So Virginia is just going to take off demographically, right? But they develop a bad reputation, a poor reputation for making good on their promises to the indentured servants. So before you know it, we have newspaper articles and other primary source materials, letters of correspondence, speeches, right? That all tend to suggest that a growing portion of these ex-indentured servants who never received the land that they were supposed to receive began moving into the same general counties and areas. And one of the most famous was the Piedmont, Piedmont. Then remember, when you look back at your Black Legend handout And you look at that last number, 4, whatever it was, right? It says basically, were the English any better? Remember, that was colonial Virginia. Remember how aristocratic it was? Remember how inequitable it was? Remember, there were literally 25 families that monopolized the most powerful political positions. I didn't have enough stats on there with land ownership, but it was just as lopsided. And those well-to-do who had the best land with lots of nitrogen and so forth were and phosphorus were it was known as the Tidewater region, Tidewater. So it didn't take long in the 1600s for a conflict to ensue between those demographically that came from the Piedmont rising up in rebellion against the Tidewater elite of the coast. And that rebellion was known as Bacon's Rebellion under a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. All right. So at any rate, when you look at this, right, tell me this, if you were working at a, I'm going to keep it general because I wouldn't begin to know how to give an example of this without it seeming offensive. A menial job, right? Something that has no prestige to it at all, according to society, has very limited opportunities that it offers for advancement and making good money ever in it, right? So let's say that you and someone else were in a menial job right now, but you're taking a full load of classes at the local JC. And someone comes to you and says, you have to quit your classes and both of you have to work as employees for this company for the rest of your lives, right? Why does it seem that one of you might more vociferously rebel against that decision? Which one of you is going to be more upset about that decision and why?
I mean, I would, and the reason would be more of you have nowhere to climb from where the position you're at the company. So what's the point of staying there? I mean, at least if you're taking a full load of classes, you have the opportunity of becoming something more.
Good. The opportunity, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Ochoa. And notice, right, is expectations, right? The person that's taking college classes has higher expectations and doesn't want to stay in that job. And so likewise, right? A lot of these, of course, you have exceptions with those who are brought against their will, those who were prison inmates, etc., right? How awful they were treated may have broken their spirit and their hope, like Richard Frethorn's letter back to his parents, which was just very sad and pitiful. But on by and large, right, generally, is you're having a group of people telling them, hey, in 3 to 7 years, your life is going to get much better. You're going to have opportunities at the end of your contract, right?
Do you think that it also depended on who they worked under? Because I mean, no matter what company, let's say you're making the same salary at every single company you're working at, but one boss is better. Obviously, you're gonna you're gonna go with the better boss because he treats you right. So, do you think it could have also been that the person he was working under was just more abusive?
Oh, absolutely. I think you can't, the same thing with slavery, right? You cannot take away the personal element of personality on a case by case basis. Absolutely. And I think also, right, if you wanted to look at a book, I said it's called Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher. And it's very simple and oftentimes in its message, but it's just very interesting to me. And that is he says that those who established the colonies in the north, in the middle states, and in the southern states all came demographically from certain distinct areas in England and from certain distinct cultures and classes in England. And when he looks at the South, he gives stat, support for this, is that the South was won by the gentry class, Gentry. All right. And the gentry had ties going back to the Norman invasion of 1066 of England from France. And even before that, some even contended, although I doubt they could prove it, that it even went back to the time of, King Arthur and defending at the fall of Rome, etc., Old Britannia. And so the gentry class, they were into deference. They were into that they clearly were not for egalitarianism, that everyone should be considered equal and on equal footing and equally valuable, equally entitled to the same stuff. No way, right? To them, God had made, all the way back to that medieval, chain of being, God had made a clear hierarchy in his creation, and there was no use in apologizing for it. And the gentry class clearly were born, in their own estimation, of higher pedigree, higher blood from former leaders of England in bygone ages. They expected people to defer to them. They expected culturally for that which was in vogue, as far as the vernacular of speaking, how you dress, music, and entertainment, etc. They expected to be able to dictate culture. They especially expected to politically be the leaders and economically have a lion's share of the wealth. Because remember the head right system from the beginning, right? For every laborer that you could afford to bring as an indentured servant, as his or her employer, you were granted a sizable amount of land. And so these vast estates arose in the Tidewater region of gentrymen who expected people to defer to them as their social betters. Excuse me. So at any rate, um, look into Bacon's Rebellion. I have a question on it on your quiz from the text. But the people in the Piedmont are going to have enough, and they're going to be fighting with Native Americans encroaching on their lands. They're going to expect their colonial government to represent and protect them militarily against their native enemies. And the royal governor, Lord Berkeley, refuses. So they raise an army illegally, extra legally, and fight an undeclared war. And so therefore they are declared guilty of treason. And of course that involved capital punishment oftentimes. So they said, heck with that. We're not going to go down. We're going to go down swinging. We might as well keep our army assembled and let's just take on our own representatives, our own state militia and government over on the east coast of Virginia. And they actually won in Bacon's Rebellion in the short run. They won and they declared a people's republic, right? And it was very kind of populist, right? We'll get into populism when we do Andrew Jackson, but kind of like democratic, like the ugly side of democracy, in which you appeal to kind of the lowest common denominators, people's resentment toward other demographics that they really are kind of ignorant of, and you milk that and you feed off of it as their leader, etc. Oftentimes when you do such, right, as an elected leader, chosen leader, the word they oftentimes use is a demagogue, right? Demagogue. And a demagogue to me is a somewhat democratically elected or agreed upon leader of the people who does it, however, for his own manipulative self-interest. He knows people's buttons. He knows what they fear, what they hate, what they desire, what they covet, right? And he or she knows exactly how to push their buttons to get them united against a common foe. And so if you look up Nathaniel Bacon, he definitely does not look like a Piedmont poor ex-indentured servant, right? Sadly, who the gentrymen later would call crackers in the South. So at any rate, when they fight in this war, right, It literally is in the records of the General Assembly that indentured servants, reliance upon indentured servants has greatly diminished. So, first of all, supply and demand factors that I would expect you to maybe briefly mention if you choose this number as to why the number of available indentured servants diminished at this time, but also, right, a diminished reliability. Why would you want to bring in and pay for an indentured servant who you're going to have access to his or her labor for only 3 to 7 years? And you have to give him his or her freedom dues at the end, right? When you could pay only 20% more and get an African slave and have him or her for life, and whatever children, you could be entitled to the children as well, in particular through the father. So, at any rate, right, look for evidence of supply and demand changing and a sense that white labor became um, perceived by the established authorities in the South as dangerous. And again, why dangerous? Going back to that idea of you having a menial job and being a full-time college student, right? Is they had high expectations. Slaves coming in did not. So hence, does that make them less apt to rebel? That's argumentative. But supposedly it was assumed by some leaders in the South. But notice there are concessions to certain written works, certain writers and philosophers, etc., right, and scientists who did adhere to racist sentiment. And so I believe they're mentioned in here at least 4, if not more. There are even ties to some leaders in the South who had, and in the North for that matter as well, who had read some of these works, and they had a hand in the legislature of their colony and deciding and helping promote, right, the slave codes. So the idea is, right, is according to Ibram Kendi, he contends that racism here in the U.S. with many of these writers and so forth, that oftentimes it was economically predicated. It was economically convenient to justify enslaving Africans. And the stereotypes you read about are to this day collectively called the Sambo image of African American men in particular, right? SAMBO. And the Sambo image is that, right, that they are unintelligent, dumb brute beasts. They follow their blind instinct like a child or an animal instead of an adult of self-control. That they're hypersexualized, and so you worry about the black men going after white women. All that stuff, all that archaic stuff, you're going to find in these writings, going back at least to the 12, 13, 1400s. But nevertheless, right, look in this thesis saying, well, those were arguably served to justify slavery. And not only that, right, was to what extent was slavery or I'm sorry, racism a divide and conquer tactic? Again, Howard Zinn's People's History of the U.S., and then also Bernard Bailyn, Bailyn. It's called The Barbarous Years. And he gives evidence of certain counties of black and white poor laborers fraternizing together, going to the same taverns, having children with one another, going to different types of entertainment with one another, et cetera, right? Even trying to get married. And so at any rate, there is some evidence, if you want to look for it, of a very deliberate effort by the powers that be to keep that from happening, to keep them from uniting with one another, and to keep them divided along class lines, right? And have that poor white ex indentured servant say, well, at least I'm not an N-word. And then, of course, the slave, the freedman, manumission was possible, but it was made very difficult to gain freedom or purchase it. Um, could say, at least I'm not a cracker. And they stayed divided for a lot of years. But some people believe that was a deliberate attempt by colonial and other leaders. Okay. Then remember agency. Agency is when a particular demographic is oftentimes in conflict history accounts, is oftentimes depicted in a as a passive victim, right? So African Americans and Native Americans and women, oftentimes in conflict history books, are depicted as passive victims, right? Well, there's spokesmen, especially during the civil rights era, who began writing history books, right, in a new style, more Marxist, more conflict ridden, but yet they added to it as they said, no, these people were moral agents. They were human beings who had power of free will, and their decisions made differences in history also, even slaves. So, as you might guess, an example of agency of slaves is the way by which they kind of balanced accommodation and rebellion, right? Coping with their situation and rebelling against it. Their culture creating power, as far as, again, coping, music and dancing and church services and other methods, other areas of food and cuisine in which African slaves contributed to Southern culture, even from that subjugated status. All right. So that's what we mean by agency. And so looking at African Americans in number five is just, it's a pretty cut and dry, simple thesis, is that there arose great demand for their labor, almost desperate demand for slaves' labor in early South Carolina. And they took advantage of it, right? And good for them for doing such. They took advantage of it and made demands as far as getting something in return. And of course, the obvious common demand was some form of manumission, of freedom from their contract. So slaves came. You have even divide and conquer tactics, according to some people, where different people from different tribes were mixed together so that they linguistically couldn't even communicate with one another and might be less apt to rebel or join together and abscond and take off and leave, right? Um, but again, here in South Carolina, look for the instances that are used to kind of give an image of almost desperation, almost desperate need for slaves' labor and them taking advantage of such. Number six, right, is self-explanatory. The title there. Believe it or not, Fogel and Ingerman wrote a book called Time on the Cross, in which they contended that physically, at the very least physically, right, not taking into account psychological harm, right, emotional harm, but physically, the average slave's life was not that brutal, simply because he or she was an expensive investment. And sadly, like any other, because remember, chattel slavery, chattel was under the category of agricultural property. So under the court of a law, a slave was no different from a tractor or a horse, sadly, under the law. So at any rate, if you have an expensive piece of machinery, an expensive human being, why would you want to run him or her down? Wouldn't you want to optimize how well he or she could work? Well, again, you have that's a very kind of almost universal debate to this day, right? If you'll indulge me being silly for a second, my little son He likes to watch The Office kind of precociously. He's pretty young, but he likes to watch The Office. And there's a scene in which one person contends, you know what, I am going to. Actually, I take that back. It might have been Parks and Rec. I think it was Parks and Rec. Sorry about that. But at any rate, one figure says, I am going to, as the eternal optimist, I'm going to praise this worker, make him feel like he is the best thing since sliced bread, and I'm going to get the biggest labor yield from him ever. Because by pumping up his self esteem, that's the sure way to get his best as my employee. Another gentleman says, no, 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 I'll make a wager on that, right? I'm going to threaten him. I'm going to threaten to fire him, to deprive him of this or that, and give him an ultimatum that if he doesn't do such and such, he's fired. And I assure you that will bring about a greater effort than your method. And so you see that in the historiography of slavery, right? And so in this case, there's plenty of evidence that there were a lot of individual planters and legislators and others who believed in the latter, that you need to be harsh with them. You need to break their spirit so they won't rebel. You need to make an example of one of them in the presence of others. I mean, you have some very Machiavellian quotes that you could find in different books about slavery. So at any rate, but notice on this number, is there's not a lot of direct evidence of actual harm. I think that's a weakness of this number, but it's more indirect, right? And saying, as you see here, why so much evidence of discontent? Why so many cases of rebellion and running away if life really wasn't that bad? And of course, letters written by the mistresses of the house give ample evidence of mistreatment. Physiological evidence of bones excavated in the slave quarters where they had been worked very, very arduously. They know the difference between some type of external wound to your shoulders and hips and something more akin to arthritis of just lifting habitual heavy weight and grinding down your bones. They can tell the difference. And there's evidence of that, of the latter, in some of the excavations at the old slave quarters in the South. So then number 7, just look for evidence of the fact of why we're not speaking French right now. And evidence of the Native Americans making decisions that dictated the course of events. And we're certainly not just passive victims. And this one here, also on test number 1, notice the title, French Louisiana, fluid by accident, right? Not by design or deliberate intention. So notice a lot of the leaders of French Louisiana, this was before they established headquarters in 1714 in Louisiana. The Enlightenment was not until the 1740s, right? 20 something years later, 26 years later. The French Revolution was not until 1789, right? In 1789 minus 1714, I'm terrible at math. I'll let you work that one out. So these were years ahead, right? So they were old school, the French leaders, kind of like the gentrymen in Virginia. They were accustomed to, literally, right? The common people were called petit yens, right? Like little people, the little commoners. But what happens is certain things, certain circumstances and situations in French Louisiana keep the leaders from maintaining that grip over society that they would have liked to keep if they could. So again, one is a demand and shortage of goods and laborers, a shortage of soldiers, a shortage of supplies, a shortage of women. So before you know it, you have this begrudging acceptance of people from categories of the population, people from demographics that never would have been considered on paper worthy of doing what they were doing, grudgingly allowed to do what they were doing because of the circumstances. So, for instance, right, is Lacombe de Iberville. This gentleman was the leader of French Louisiana, and he wrote a famous letter back to France and said, "We are so bereft of supplies that I literally am trading with French and other pirates of the Caribbean," right? A famous case is John Lafitte, Laffite, right? Infamous Blackbeard, right? Was known to go into Louisiana. And so Lafitte, that guy was ruthless in some of his turf wars, associated with multiple murders. But he came in and lived like a rock star when he came into New Orleans. And people rolled out the red carpet for him. And of course, there was an element of fear, kind of like Al Capone coming into the place, right, in the 20s. So again, the governor said, right, I have people growing commodities and building commodities and selling them that are not legally allowed according to our charter to do such. But hungry mouths don't care if mercantilist restrictions are being upheld or not. I don't care if it's a pirate that gives me my cheese and wine, not to be stereotypical of the French. You know, uh, there were high demands for certain commodities, and if they couldn't give it to them from France, they were going to get it by whatever means necessary. So you have people without the proper licenses becoming artisans or skilled workers, becoming merchants or middlemen, selling something, right, that they buy cheaply in one market, selling it more expensively in another. People commercial cash crop farming and helping to feed and sustain the population, but initially were not entitled to a land tract and couldn't afford one, but were begrudgingly allowed. French men that began to have develop a quote quadroon population, a population of biracial um, young men and women through their union with slaves, with slave women, and also with indigenous women from the Natchez and other tribes there in New Orleans. So again, right, the idea that this became a land of opportunity in French Louisiana, but not by design. It just organically happened that way. Excuse me. I want to count this one more time, you guys, because I'm counting 20 of you now, and I thought I had 18. Give me just a moment as I'm going to, here we are, going to find the two or three other names. Make sure all of you get your credit. Okay, I found one. So I think I just need to find one more. Sorry, guys. Okay, I found it. All right, so are there any other questions? Are there any questions from anyone?
I have one.
Yes.
On the test, how important are knowing dates? I mean,
Not very important at all.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
not
have
very
trouble
important at all.
remembering them. All right.
I tell you what, I'm gonna have to. It's a laborious task. I have to put in every question and every option A through D. That's gonna take me a while. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna attach it underneath the assignment. I'm just gonna attach it in modules and label it as test one, and let you just open it up as one document and take a look at it. Okay. I'm going to do that literally tonight. All right. So you can get a little advance notice as far as how I frame my questions, etc.
Okay.
Okay. I'd be happy to do that.
And then for the quiz, I haven't taken a look at it, but the reason is because I haven't gotten my book in yet. It should be coming in, I think, within the next 2 days. If we've been covering and reading the material you've been given us, would we be fine, or do we have to go through the textbook as well?
Yeah, you know what? To be honest, I frame the questions as I'll say, how does Alan Brinkley, right, the author of the text, how does he depict such and such? What's his interpretation? What does he focus on with slavery? And so, to be honest, you kind of have to have the book. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it comes in within the next 2 days, so I mean, it'll still give me
Okay.
some time before
Yeah,
Sunday.
just I tell you what, Jose, just shoot me a Canvas message as a reminder after this meeting, and I'll cut you slack for the first one being late if you don't get it in time to submit it by Sunday night.
Okay, thank you,
I
Professor.
reserve that in my syllabus to make exceptions, but I definitely would like you guys to try to do that by Sunday night. Okay, as this is now the this will be the third week, and hopefully you have had ample time to get that book. Anyone else? All right. Okay, if there isn't anything else, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. So it'll take me a good 20 minutes to have this darn thing downloaded and then put it online. But don't forget, okay, you have your textbook quiz as well as this assignment due Sunday at midnight. And I will post the first test, for you to be able to look at the questions and how I pose them. All right. All right, you guys. You guys have a good week, okay? I hope this video helped. All right. Come on.